Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. Before we get started, if you wouldn't mind hitting the like button before we get too far into the video, that really helps my channel a lot. I appreciate it. Also, I love it if you leave a comment. I appreciate your input. One of the more frequent questions I get is, how do you make it look so easy when you're soldering? And one of the things I remember as a beginner was it was difficult to keep in mind all of the different things that you had to keep track of while you were first learning how to solder. And so I'm going to talk about 5 different tips for beginners regarding soldering and how to get past some of the hurdles that you have as a beginner. So we'll do that. Before we get started, I wanted to thank some groups of people, my patrons over on Patreon. They're my core group of supporters, and I really appreciate not only their financial contribution, but the really nice community that they've built over there. The other group is my YouTube subscribers. We just passed 11,600, which is amazing and awesome. Thank you for that. I really appreciate the kind comments you all leave, as well as the little financial things like the buy me a coffee and the super thanks. Those things really help with the cost of materials these days, so thank you for that. Okay, well, let's get started on these tips. This is one of my design idea books. I have a number of different covered designs on my merch store if you're interested. I generally draw things up in advance anymore. It tends to give me a little bit better outcome. So I didn't draw too much for this one since it's not really a project video, it's more of a technique kind of video, but I did kind of outline what I'm going to talk about here, and I split it up into 5 different things. There's lots of different tips you can learn about for soldering, but I focused on the main things that I see people having problems with when they're beginners. The first one that we'll talk about is not having pieces touching when you're going to solder them together, and that's a big problem. Second one is not fluxing your piece well enough. We'll talk a little bit about that. Not heating your piece in the right way or heating it unevenly, and this is particularly problematic when you're soldering something big to something small, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Another thing that's really common with people when they're beginners is they have a very small torch to start with because it's a cheap way to get into things. And when you start getting into bigger pieces, that becomes difficult to do with those little tiny torches. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, how you direct your flame onto your piece has a big role in how well your soldering is going to happen. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about why soldering feels so awkward at first. From my experience, when you're first starting to solder, you've been told that you have to do all of these different things, and you have to keep all of those in your mind all at once while you're trying to do something brand new that you've never done before. And it's a little bit challenging because really your brain can only process one thing at a time. And until you've developed some automated scripts in your brain that just cause you to do things the way they're supposed to be done, it feels overwhelming because not only are you trying to remember to keep the heat moving, you're trying to remember how far to keep the torch away from the piece, you're trying to pay attention to where the heat needs to be directed, you're watching your solder to see when it flows. You have all of these different things that you have to keep track of in your mind. And sometimes when you're focusing on one thing, you forget about the other one because you just haven't developed those automated behaviors in your brain yet. So the good thing is it doesn't take very long to develop those with a little practice, and we'll talk about some of those as we go. Let's talk about when you have a space between two things that you're trying to solder together. Okay, this is an example. This is just a band that I've put together and gotten ready to solder, but notice there's a space there, and when I push it together to get it to stay there, it springs back, and that's because of the way the metal is. It's got a little bit of springiness to it. So if you go to try and solder this together, even if it's a little bit closer than that, let me see if I can get it a little bit closer. I kind of left it open exaggeratedly. Let's say it's that close together. It's not too far apart then. The biggest problem with stuff like this is that solder likes to run along surfaces, and it does not like to fill in gaps. It's not really like spackle or Bondo or something like that that you can kind of glob over something and fill in. That would be really nice if that were the case sometimes, but it really doesn't. But if you have two surfaces that are touching each other, it loves to flow right between those two and stick them together. And so in order for that to work really well, we want these two pieces to be touching. Now, one of the other issues with that is that even if you had it touching and it was just barely touching, sometimes when you heat the metal, any kind of work hardening that it has starts to come out of it, and it relaxes as the molecular structure changes, because when you heat up the metal, any springiness it has starts to go away. And so sometimes it relaxes and pulls apart a little bit, and then there will be a gap again there. So you want to make sure that your pieces are touching and pushing together adequately. So when you go to solder this, even if it relaxes a little bit under the heat, it's still going to be touching, and so the solder will have a good seam to flow into. So that's one of the things you need to think about. So let's go ahead and solder this real quick once I get it lined up a little better. Let's put a little bit of flux on here. Broke out a nice pristine pad for this one. Alright, so let's say we want to put this on here. Got it touching both sides of that gap there. Now that it's touching nicely, we shouldn't have any problem getting it to solder. One thing you want to make sure of is that the entire piece reaches the temperature that the solder will melt at. So you shouldn't have any problem soldering that then. Then you can just remove any excess solder. So that's one thing to think about. So number two is not fluxing enough, because what flux does, at least according to everything I've always read, is that it does a couple of things, especially if you're using a self-pickling flux like I use. What that does is it dissolves some of the oxides that have formed on the surface of the metal. Like this one's really dark because I annealed it and haven't soaked it in any pickle safe or anything, and so it's kind of oxidized. If you use a self-pickling flux, it takes some of that oxide off and then gets it all nice and ready to go. But it's important when you go to flux something that, and this is the order that I do things in, is I get my torch lit, I dribble some flux on there, and then I immediately dry the flux. And the reason I do that is because if you wait too long after you put some on there, a lot of it will soak into your soldering pad or evaporate, and then you'll have a difficult time getting a nice crusty coating on there. And so we want it to have enough flux on there to where it bubbles up and becomes kind of a white coating on there. And then we'll keep heating it till it settles down a little bit. But let's do that and see how that works. If you do it first like this, and then spend some time lighting your torch and getting everything adjusted and making sure you have some solder cut, sometimes it's hard to get it crusty. So like this, see? It really didn't get very white and crusty, and so I may have trouble getting my solder to stick to that. So if you heat it a little bit, dribble some on. See how it's getting a little kind of white crusty coating on there? That's what you really want, and that'll make it so that you can solder a lot better. So let's put a little piece of solder over here. This is just some pieces of scrap that I kind of laying around. Here's a bonus trick for you. Flux, when it gets hot again, it becomes a little bit sticky. And so if you put your piece of solder on there and heat up the flux a little bit, it gets kind of gluey, and then it'll kind of hold your piece of solder in place. Alright, so now we got this on. Let's go ahead and heat these. So you didn't have a problem soldering that at all. The key takeaway from that is make sure that you have a nice crusty coating on your piece where you're going to be soldering it. That really makes it work much better. The third thing that I want to talk about, understanding where the heat needs to go because of the mass, where the mass is in the piece. All right, so one of the characteristics of silver, and this is universal as far as I can tell with silver, is if you want two pieces to stick together, you need to get both pieces up to the soldering temperature's melting point and flow point. And so an example of this would be, say I have this little piece, excuse me, that's kind of a good sized piece, and I'm trying to solder it to something small like this. Okay? So the solder that I'm using is hard silver solder, and it melts at about 1450 degrees, and sterling silver melts at about 1650 or so. And if I want these two to stick together well, in order for the solder to stick to them, the metal's temperature needs to melt the solder. Okay? And this is a distinction from melting the solder with a torch. As a beginner, I remember it was tempting, if I have a piece of solder right here between the two, it's super tempting to focus the heat right on that piece of solder because you know that's what you're trying to melt, and you just want to melt it so it sticks to both. However, melting it with the flame generally causes it to just ball up and sit on top of both pieces. The other issue with this is this having so much more mass than this can take a lot more heat before it becomes in danger of melting. This, on the other hand, will melt relatively easily in a shorter period of time because it doesn't take near as much heat being pumped into it for it to reach that 1450 degrees, much less the 1650 degrees that it takes to cause it to melt. And so if you're trying to get the solder to stick to both of them, it takes longer for this piece to get up to the 1450 degrees than this one. It's much easier for the smaller piece to reach that temperature. So you need to play with the heat in order to get them to reach that temperature at about the same time. And since you know this one takes longer to heat up, you're going to focus more of your heat on this piece and very little on this piece, because just by being in proximity to this piece, that's going to get pretty hot pretty quick, if that makes sense. So most of your heat's going to get focused on the bigger chunk until the very end, and then you're going to kind of start hitting both of them, okay? Because it takes much longer to get this up to temperature. So let's do that and see how that works. I remember when I first started doing this, I had a lot of times where I was trying to solder. Like I did some freeform castings, like bean castings and broom castings, and I wanted to put a jump ring on one of them. And some of those, weigh half an ounce or something because they're pretty massive. And trying to put a little one, I kept melting the jump ring over and over and never getting it to stick, and I couldn't figure out why until it finally dawned on me that for that to work, I needed to get them both up to that temperature at about the same time. So here's a piece of solder. Let's get this fluxed here a little bit. Sometimes if you have a little ring like this, it's hard to get it crusty because it doesn't have much flat surface area for the flux to puddle on. If you keep going, usually you can get it to do that. Alright, so I'm going to put this on here. Remember how I said we need to heat mostly the bigger piece first because it's got a lot more mass than the other piece. So spend some time over here before we start hitting both of them. I'm watching the color of the metal too. It starts to get a little glowy like that. I'm starting to get close. And then I can start hitting both pieces. See, I'm just kind of circling over the ring too now. Okay. So just like that. If you haven't heard, I finished my ebook, which is a guide to all my 2023 videos. So it's downloadable now from my merch store, and it's a great resource if you're looking for project ideas, because it includes a page for each of the project videos that I did, which was roughly 150 last year. And each page has a picture of the piece, a picture of the drawing I made beforehand, a list of the materials you need, the difficulty level of the piece, some notes I made about the process on that particular project, and a link to the piece if you want to watch the video on how to do it. So it's a great resource. It's downloadable from my merch store. There's also a link in the video description down below, so make sure to check that out. It's worthwhile, I think. So, okay, and fourth problem that I see with beginners, especially online, I get this question a lot, is I can't seem to get my solder to flow on the piece I'm working on. And usually when I ask what kind of torch they're using, oftentimes they're using one of the little portable butane torches, because that's a cheap, easy way to get started in this as a discipline and get a feel for what it's like. However, and this is an example of one right here. Let's see. They're portable, they run on butane, and they're great for little stuff. But the problem is they just don't produce that much heat. And so if you decide you want to start getting into like making big tough bracelets with a lot of mass, these are probably over an ounce in silver on each one of these, it's going to be super hard to get this up to the 1450 degrees that it is required in order to get hard solder to stick to it. And even if you're using easy or medium, those easy is about 180 degrees less in the melting temperature from hard silver solder, so it's not really that much lower, honestly. And so just switching to easy solder or something is not really going to help you that much. The total mass of the piece, once it starts to become assembled, is just too much mass to get up to the right temperature with one of those small torches. And don't get me wrong, I like the little small torches. They're kind of cool for some things. They're great for making jump rings and stuff, or little small bands. But if you're doing something large with a lot of mass, they are going to have trouble getting it up to temperature. Even the propane plumber's torches that I have my beginners use to start with run into problems when you start getting into something like this. So much easier if you have an acetylene air torch or something hot like that. So that is a problem with using those little ones. They just don't allow you to do really big, massive stuff. So if you're having a problem and you're doing a big piece, consider that maybe you need a hotter torch. That's one thing that I would suggest. So it's not a terrible idea to start with a small torch, make a bunch of stuff that you can sell, save up your pennies, and get a nicer, bigger torch. So that's what I did way back when, and it worked out pretty well. So you can make lots of little stuff with those things. They're great. So this last one, let's talk about the distance that you have the flame away from the piece. So in order to get a piece up to the soldering temperature, you need to heat the entire piece pretty evenly in order to get it up to that temperature. Beginners oftentimes, from my experience, are a little bit nervous about the torch, and I've told them about the melting temperatures and stuff, and so they're real cautious about getting the torch right on the metal. And so they hold the torch really far back. And what that generally does is it causes the silver itself to oxidize, because you're just basically basting it with heat for a long period of time and never quite getting it up to the soldering temperature. And the solder itself will start to turn black too, and that raises its melting temperature a little bit as well, which causes you to have problems getting it to flow. So keeping it far back like this is counterproductive. The other thing is, when people are not doing what they need to do as beginners by heating the entire piece, sometimes they're just focusing on one spot, and so they have trouble getting the solder to flow because of that. Because if you're focusing over here, this part of the piece is acting as a little radiator bleeding off heat. If you're focused over here, it starts to lose heat over here. Silver loses and gains heat pretty quickly. So beginners oftentimes don't realize that and haven't put that into their little scripts in their brain that you got to keep it moving all the time. and so they focus just on one spot. And sometimes, because their solder is not flowing when they do that, they'll move their torch in too close like that, okay? And what happens oftentimes is you'll melt that spot of your piece because you've jammed the flame, either the tip right close there and kept it in one spot, or you'll actually see how it creates a little black spot in the middle there. That's a cold spot when you squish the blue flame here. The hottest part of the blue flame on your torch is going to be right at the tip there. See how bright red it turns this pick really quick? So if you want to heat your piece efficiently and effectively, you want to put that blue tip right above the metal and keep it moving all the time. So the best piece of advice I can give you as a beginning solderer is to practice a lot. You know, practice soldering lots of little things together. And when things don't go right, stop and think about what happened, because that's when you learn stuff, is when you make a mistake, you stop, rather than getting upset about it, which is easy to do, stop and think about, why did that happen? Okay, did I heat it evenly enough? Did I have it fluxed well enough? Was I moving the heat around? Did I have the torch too close or too far away? What went wrong, and how do I correct it on the next one? And usually you gradually start to get better. It's like when I tell people about bezels. When you first make a bezel, usually people knock one out of the park on the first one or two of them, and then they go through a period where they melt a whole bunch of bezels. And I think you get a little overconfident because they worked really well the first couple of times with some guided assistance, and then you get a little careless and then you start melting them. So, but after maybe 30 bezels, you no longer have that problem. It just starts to become routine. So getting those automated tasks that you need to keep track of in your brain happens more effectively the more you practice. Okay, to summarize, if you're having problems soldering, go through this checklist and see if you're doing these things. Okay, are my pieces touching each other adequately so that they'll stay touching even when I heat it up? That's number one. Number two, do I have it fluxed adequately? Is it got a crusty coating on it to prevent it from oxidizing under the heat, because the heat oxidizes it quickly? Third, make sure that you're aware of where the mass in the piece is so that you can heat it accordingly. Bigger chunks need more heat applied to them in order to get them up to the soldering temperature versus smaller pieces. So keep the heat moving around, but focus a little bit more on the bigger pieces until they're up to temperature, and then you can start hitting the little pieces too, and then usually that works out pretty well. Fourth, consider the torch that you're using. Is it adequate for the task? The little ones are great for small things, but if you're working on something big that has a lot of mass to it, you may need a bigger torch. So that's something to think about. Finally, how close are you holding your torch, and are you using the flame effectively? The hottest part of the flame is going to be the tip of the blue cone, no matter what torch that you're using, pretty much. So if you're holding that blue cone too far away from the piece, it's not going to get hot enough to solder. If you're holding it too close, you may either melt part of your piece, or you're dispersing the heat by squishing that blue flame into your soldering pad, causing it to not heat effectively. So those are some things that can cause some soldering malfunctions. So really, the more that you practice, the less you'll have to remember all those various things, because you'll automatically start doing them. So continue practicing, have fun, don't get too upset when you make a mistake and something melts. It's just consider it a practice project, you know. We all melt things. I still melt things all the time. So it happens, but the best way to deal with it is to use it as a learning experience and figure out what went wrong and do better the following time. Okay, well, that was 5 different tips for beginners who are learning how to solder. I hope that was useful to you. If it was, make sure to hit the like button before you leave. And take a few moments to peruse some of my other videos. I have about 315 or 320 up there now. I keep meaning to check, and I haven't checked lately, but we passed 300 quite a while ago. So there's lots of content there for all different levels. A lot of good ideas, I think, for projects, and some techniques and stuff like that. So check it out. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, and Visit the video description down below as well. There's some important links. There's a link to my new ebook that I just finished, and it's a guide to all of my 2023 videos. It includes the materials for each project. It includes a picture of the sketch that I drew, the final project, some notes that I wrote about it, things about whether it was difficult, what parts of it were challenging, what I might have done different, as well as a live link to the video. So it's a really useful resource. It gives you a whole bunch of projects right at your fingertips, and I think it's worth downloading. So check that out. There's also some other links. There's a link to my safety video, because it's important to keep safety in mind when you're doing this. There's a link to my Patreon site if you want to check out how to become more involved with that. My merch store if you want to get yourself a nice design idea book or download that book I just talked about. And there's a link to the Buy Me a Coffee thing if you want to give me a little cash influx for materials. So either way, thanks for visiting. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Happy silversmithing.